Welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Stories of Determination. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani Fospender. Like in nature, we see determined flowers and vines clinging to life and seeking light. So are Morning Glory people. And in this podcast, I'll interview writers, activists, artists, entrepreneurs, survivors and thrivers, and trailblazers of all kinds. These are folks that have been determined to get over, under, around, and through the obstacles that face them, or to seize the opportunities that come before them. I find these people inspiring and amazing. I know you will too. I'm thrilled to bring to the Morning Glory Project today Francine Falk-Allen. She survived polio and 6 months of hospitalization at the age of 3. Emerging with a lifetime-paralyzed leg, she has learned to love for its seemingly indomitable will to support her active life. She's also a breast cancer survivor and had many, quote, childhood illnesses, which are now preventable by vaccines. As a former art major who got a BA in managerial accounting and ran her own business for 33 years, she's always craved creative outlets. This has taken the form of singing and recording with various groups, painting and writing songs, poetry, and essays. Francine's memoir, Not a Poster Child, Living Well with a Disability, a memoir, has won gold and silver medals and has been included on several lists of the best books of 2018. She was named one of the, quote, 25 women making a difference in 2019 by Conversations magazine. She facilitates polio survivors of Marin County, a meetup writing group, Just Right Marin County, and she's on the City of San Rafael's Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Committee. She was the polio representative interviewed in a PBS Nobel Prize media film, The War Against Microbes. She loves the outdoors, gardening, pool exercise, her 2 silly cats, and spending time with good friends, her husband Richard Falk, strong British tea, and a little champagne now and then. I like that last part, Francine. Francine, thanks so much for coming on to the Morning Glory Project. I'm glad to have you today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the invitation.
Your memoir, I'm intrigued most particularly by the title, Not a Poster Child. Can you tell me a bit about that? How you came to that?
Sure. When I was small, when I was probably 5 or 6, people used to approach me and say, I saw your picture on the March of Dimes poster. There were these March of Dimes posters all over the place, and there were placards with spaces to put dimes in, which was the equivalent of nearly $1 in the early 1950s. So people would say, I saw your picture on the March of Dimes poster, and it happened more than once. It was intriguing to me, even at that age. So I asked my mother, am I going to be on the March of Dimes poster? And she said, no, you're not going to be on the poster. And so what I realized was that people saw this little girl with brown ringlets, brown hair ringlets and kidney sticks. And we all looked the same to them. And I realized that when people saw me, even people who knew me, they identified me as the crippled kid, that I was that girl. I wasn't Francine, the smart girl, or Francine, the funny girl, or Francine, the girl that likes to sing, that little girl that likes to sing. I wasn't that. I was the crippled girl. And that even people who knew me didn't see that that was not my picture on the poster. And it really irked me, even though I was little, that I was identified that way, not by my personality or my face or whatever. It was by the fact that I was crippled. And I realized that the little girl on the poster was always happy, and people expected disabled people to be cheery all the time because it makes everyone feel better if you're not having a bad time of it. So that's why I titled the book Not a Poster Child. I also have not necessarily been the poster child for being a cheery cripple. I have complained about it when it seemed necessary. And anyway, that's behind the title.
And complain, I'm going to choose to interrupt and reframe your word a little bit. you've also been an activist about this. It's not just simply complaint. You've been working on the rights and protections for people who have disabilities as well.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. Well, also, I mean, it comes up in a lot of different ways. Working with doctors, particularly these days, they don't always know what the situation is with a polio survivor, because a lot of the doctors who really knew polio have died or they're no longer working. There are very few left. So a lot of times you have to educate them, and they'll say things that really surprise me, like, well, of course you don't exercise. And I exercise more than a lot of my friends do. I do pool exercise. And so there are these disparaging things that happen. Also, we find as polio survivors that we have to tell doctors what we can do and that we easily fatigue. So, there are a lot of different things like that. I'm on the committee for reviewing Americans for Disabilities Act issues for the city of San Rafael. And I guess there I become an advocate because not everyone on the committee has a disability. Some people do. And we look at things like contractors may put the disabled parking too far away because they need to have a certain degree of ramp for wheelchairs. But most disabled people are not in wheelchairs. They're walking. They're using walkers and canes and crutches, and we need the parking to be closer. So those are the kinds of things that get discussed there.
You get to be the real person talking about what it's really like to have to navigate those challenges.
And then in our polio survivors group, we talk about how to get the care that we need and issues that come up with our family and that sort of thing. So I guess in that way, I am an activist. I give people a format to talk about it. And if they need to complain, it's a safe place to do it.
Well, I'm struck by an irony as you talk, in that the residue of this disease that you had as a small child still lives with you. And it has outlived most of the doctors because the disease itself hasn't been fully eradicated, of course, but is much different than it was in the 50s and, that era when it was such a terrifying and more frequent occurrence. So the disease is outliving the doctors that know how to treat it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well,
or the effects of the disease.
The effects of it. Now, the disease itself, they are still trying to eradicate it, and it's almost gone. There are only about 3 countries that still have new cases of polio. Now, the issue is that when polio survivors, even the ones that didn't have residual paralysis, when they become, about, say, 30 to 50 years after they've had the disease, they start having new problems. And it takes
new innovation to kind of figure out how to address the new concerns.
It does. And it's not expected by everyone. So an older polio survivor, say 30 to 50 years after they've had the initial onset, will find that they're having fatigue and weakness or new pain, new muscle pain. So they go to see a doctor, and the doctor will call it chronic fatigue or something like that. Or maybe it's Epstein-Barr's. They don't recognize that it could be after effects of this. And it's common. It happens to 50 to 75% of polio survivors.
Wow.
So that's something that they're not prepared to address unless they've had some education.
Well, so let me turn the clock back, Francine, and tell me about your initial experience with this as a little one and what your recollection is of what happened and what was childhood like for you because of this turn.
Ooh, I have a whole book about that. So initially, what I'm told is that I complained of my shoes hurting in my sleep, and my mother says I wasn't wearing shoes, so I must have felt a tight feeling in my feet. And I ran a fever for a week, and it seemed that went away, and I was fine. And then I was playing across the street at a friend's house, and my friend's mother called my mother and said, "Frances," that was my mom's name, "Francine won't get up off the floor." So my leg was paralyzed. And then that's when the diagnosis came. It was after the fever had passed, actually. Then they put me in quarantine in a tiny little room by myself for 2 weeks. And that was pretty horrible, actually.
And you were how old?
I was 3.
And you recall that today?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I can still picture the room and my parents coming in dressed in what looked like bed sheets. And I reached over the edge of my crib and said, "Mama, pick me up." And she couldn't. And my parents both looked like they'd been crying and they couldn't touch me. So they didn't come back and visit again because it was too upsetting. So I was stuck in this little room by myself for 2 weeks.
You said they didn't come back because it was too upsetting. Do you mean it was too upsetting to you?
I think it was too upsetting for me, I think, but them as well. I mean, they couldn't touch me. They couldn't pick me up. All they could do was talk to me. And for a 3-year-old, that's pretty hard to understand. So it was just easier to leave it. And also, I was in quarantine. They had to stand several feet away from me, just like now with the COVID-19 virus.
Well, I was just thinking that. I was thinking how heartbreaking it is for so many people whose loved ones are ill that they can't comfort them. They can't go in. They can't.
That's right. That's right.
And these days, unlike in the 50s and 60s, of course, we have video chat and things to help bridge the gaps a bit. But gosh, to think of having a loved one and not be able to go comfort them is so hard.
Really, maybe not for the people that are in the hospital too. They may not be well enough to be able to be on a video chat. Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day too. I know what quarantine is, and it's really tough. It's really tough when all you see are doctors and nurses that you don't know.
And doctors and nurses who also are wearing garments that look like bed sheets and covering their faces and having some distance too.
Exactly. At least as an adult, adults understand that. Children
you must
don't.
really be watching what's going on with the COVID-19 epidemic through different eyes than some of us are looking at it.
Well, to some degree. I mean, I hate hospitals, and I feel sorry for people that are going through this. I mean, it's certainly much worse. I wasn't dying, of lung disease, so much different. And I went into a rehab hospital. It was actually a converted hotel where there were between 20 and 40 kids in the huge room. It was like a ballroom, and it had been converted into a hospital for polio kids. So I was there for 6 months, and my mother could come and see me every day. And my sister came a few times. My sister was much older than I was. She was an older teenager when I was born. So she did come and visit, but basically it was just me and my mom for 6 months, and they let me go home on the weekends, and that's when I'd see my father, who was the one that I had a more affectionate relationship with, actually.
So by that time you weren't contagious, so you could go home, but you needed to stay there for rehabilitation?
Exactly. And they had told my parents that I would never walk again. I was going to be in a wheelchair the rest of my life, but that wasn't what turned out to happen. There was a point at which the physical therapy people said, "We think that we might be able to teach you to walk." So they did. There was I remember the first time I went into the physical therapy room, and they handed me these little kidney sticks. And
a kidney stick is what, the kind of crutches we think of with the cuffs that go around your arm?
Yes, except they were much different than they had a piece. The cuff was a piece of, it looked like the straps for army cots, and they didn't have the hinge on them that the arm cuff crutches have now. So they were like a half crutch, a crutch that was cut off with a cuff around the forearm. So they had these little footprints laid out on the floor exactly in my gait distance, in red and blue, because I couldn't differentiate left and right yet. So there was light blue for right and red for left. And it looked like a little elf had walked through the therapy room with all these little footprints set out on the floor. And then they had little crutch tip circles next to them so that they could show me where to put my feet and where to put the crutches in order to learn to walk again.
And did they put color on your shoes so that you'd know which?
They put them on the crutches.
Okay.
But not the shoes. So yeah, little red and blue ribbons on the crutches.
Wow.
I've often thought, I wonder who cut out all those little footprints. That was such a sweet thing to do. It was really, really an interesting solution that they figured that out.
Also a really sensitive solution. Somebody tuned into the fact that you were a little girl.
Yeah, exactly. It was interesting also. I found a letter from my mother to my father, because my father was in Northern California looking for a new place for us to live part of the time. And my mother had an apartment in Santa Monica near the hospital. And my mother wrote to my dad, and she said that she'd had this experience watching me do the physical therapy. And she'd spoken to the therapist afterwards and said, I don't think you're being strict enough with her. And they said to her, well, Francine's a really sensitive child, and we find that if we reprimand her, it is very upsetting for her, and she just cries. But if we encourage her, she's one of the best students we have. And my mother thought that was really a strange way to deal with the child. So you can imagine what my relationship with my mother was like after that, growing up.
Yeah. That was not who she was. And she had her own deficits of a sort, I'm understanding through your story. And
she was born in 1908, so she had a really different perspective about how children should be raised.
Right. The old-fashioned way.
Yeah, very.
Well, so I'm going to ask you this question, but I'm going to ask you to answer it in two eras. I always try to get at, in these conversations on this podcast, I try to get at how did people get through what they got through? And I want to ask it for you as a kid, but also as a grown woman now. Like, what are the most difficult challenges of those two time periods, as a little one and as now? And how do you get through them? What was the hardest part? In addition to, obviously, physical pain and all of those things, but what were the hard times?
The pain didn't last that long. The weakness was the difficulty. And being in the hospital was really tough because I couldn't play with anyone. There was no one to play. They didn't really allow us to get together and play. It would have been too much difficulty for the personnel there. So it was very, very lonely. And I remember feeling like this was going to be my life forever. And at 3, being in the hospital for 6 months, that was a sixth of my life. It was a long period of time. So that was just accepting that there was no other solution and that I wasn't going to be allowed to leave until some point that I couldn't determine. That was really, really tough emotionally. And then learning to walk was hard, but I had a sense of freedom about that. And I didn't know that my parents had been told that I would be in a wheelchair the rest of my life. My mother didn't tell me that until I was an older child or maybe a young teenager. So I've thought about this a lot, and I don't exactly know where it came from, but I seem to have a certain determination and perseverance and resilience that's innate. I can't really say that I had to develop it, I guess. It's one of those things where, necessity is the mother of invention. And my mom was tough with me. She made me do things myself a lot. And she made it really clear, you're going to have to take care of yourself. People aren't going to take care of you. And so I wanted to have a good time. That was my motivation more than anything.
You might be not giving yourself quite enough credit in terms of the determination department to assume that it was just something inborn in you. And yes, of course, we all have our personality that we come into the planet with. But it also seems like you focused on what you wanted. You focused on the fun. You focused on wanting to play again. You focused on those things that were important to you, and not just on the challenges, the choice of where to put your gaze, where to set your sights.
Yes.
To be a decision that you made even as a little girl.
Yes. And there were very tough times. I mean, kids made fun of me. I got bullied physically too. And I would cry, but I had friends. And friends became extremely important to me. I felt caged if I couldn't get out and be with people. And I'm actually not an extrovert. I'm more of an introvert. I like to spend a lot of time alone. I love to read. I love to be in the garden. Music is important to me, but connection with friends has always been really primary.
Well, I'm thinking about the lesson that you were just talking about, how relevant it is for people right now. You were saying that, you were isolated and lonely and not knowing when that isolation was going to end. And so many people right now are in that, in our shelter in place condition that so many of us are in. So many of us that are fortunate enough to be able to that. We're not out on the front lines taking care of people and all of that. Not knowing how long it's going to be, I think, is one of the things that's really troubling people.
It is, and it's sort of like, the thing where they put the frog in cold water and then heat it up.
Right.
I was thinking how the dates that they give us, the first it was going to be April 7th, and then the end of April or May 1st. And then someone recently said, well, I don't think that's going to be it. It's probably going to be June 1st, and then we'll make it through the summer maybe. And then this may start up again in the fall. Yeah, it is hard. It is hard. Couple of my girlfriends have committed to calling somebody every day, at least one person, one friend. And I've started doing that as well. And I've been trying to think of the people who live alone first, because I have someone to talk to, even if we do end up bickering. I have someone who's a scientist I'm living with, and he knows a lot about this stuff. So if I have questions, he can say, oh, no, that's not the way it is, So not only that, but, we watch a movie together, we have a nice time, we eat together. But the people that are alone are the ones that I feel, need a little more attention. So I've been trying to think of people to call each day. And I'm also on Zoom now.
So back to my original question, was kind of how you got through things as a kid, was kind of focusing on the fun things that you wanted to do. And so I'm wondering today, I know that you are active, you work on your health a lot, and you make the most of the abilities that you have and are conscious of, and all of that about the limited abilities that you don't have. But I'm wondering, what are the dark moments now as an adult? When does it get to you? Does it get to you still?
Oh yeah, because losing function happens to pretty much everyone. But for polio survivor, it happens a little earlier. I started having post-polio effects when I was in my 50s. And it was frightening to not be able to walk as far, to have significant back pain. And it's frightening. The effects are worsening for me too. And I get angry, but what it comes down to is what's going to make a difference. So I do pool exercise and I do yoga every single morning, and I try to look out the window and look for the things that bring me joy. If things are really tough, I mean, there's always grief. When you can always find that. It will come to find you. So dwelling on it is not a great solution. And I like to garden. I like flowers. I look out the window and see that I have a beautiful garden. And I like being with my husband. He has a good sense of humor. I love my friends. I love music. I still sing once in a while with different groups. That hasn't been particularly frequent. I had to quit doing that because I was in a group that had a lot of choreography, or they had started adding choreography to make the group more interesting, and I just couldn't do it. So I had to quit that. So I haven't done that regularly. So there are losses, but there's so many beautiful things too. And writing is great. My writing group gives me a lot of sustenance. We don't talk a whole lot, but we write together and we talk about what we're writing about, and it's regenerating.
Well, I have one other question, and this is something that I've spoken with you about in the past because I was curious about it, because you use the term handicapped. You you use that term. And that was one of those terms that got scolded out of me a while back, that because of its origins about people being beggars and putting out their cap for money, that I guess that's the origin of that word. And some people who have physical challenges are offended by that term, and you use it. So can you tell me a little bit about why you use that as opposed to disabled person? Or
Yes. Yeah, I actually didn't realize it was so controversial until I wrote this book. But I have felt, well, first of all, when I started identifying as a disabled or handicapped person, it wasn't until I was well into my 30s. I was really trying to be a normie all the time. I didn't want to even be seen with disabled people because it would draw more attention to my limp, which is significant. A 2-inch limp is something you cannot disguise. So I was going to Sonoma State and getting a degree in managerial accounting after realizing that being an art major wasn't going to be a really remunerative career. So at some point, I met Anthony Tussler, who was one of the people who started the Disabled Student Union there at Sonoma State. And he said, "Do you have a handicap placard for your car?" And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "Well, you can park closer. You don't have to walk quite as far if you have the disabled person parking." But it was called handicap parking then. And at that time, that was considered to be less derogatory than disabled. And that has just stuck for me, that handicap means you need an allowance to be able to do what other people do. You need a little more time, or you need people to realize that you have something that holds you back a little bit. But it's not the same as the term disabled, which sounds like you're stuck at home in a wheelchair, at least to me and to a lot of people who have physical challenges. And in the 90s, when the Americans for Disabilities Act was passed, or Americans with Disabilities Act, it was the early 90s, and they were working on that all through the 80s to get that passed. They worked really hard. And it was mostly, well, it wasn't entirely, but a lot of people who worked on it were in wheelchairs. And the focus was partly just to get ramps put in and elevators so that people who were in wheelchairs and walking with crutches would be able to enter buildings and be able to participate. So what happened, and this happened in more than one organization, is that the federal term disabled allowed for funding, whereas handicap didn't. I mean, that's part of it. That's not 100% what the issue was. But I think also the community of people who were working on the Americans with Disabilities Act wanted to embrace the fact that they were disabled and not be pushed into the background all the time. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a film on Netflix right now called Crip Camp, and it's all about the disability rights movement, and it's really inspiring. It's a great flick. Just came out.
Like Crippled, only Crip Camp?
Yeah, it's called Crip Camp. And, within the disability or handicap community, we refer to each other as Crips, but it's harder when someone else calls you that, but we use it.
Well, that's like so many terms that are internal in a group, whether they're racial terms or sexual preference terms or whatever, that the members of the group may use the terms but don't use them against us, kind of a word.
Yes. So I recently got busted for this by another author. She said that it makes her cringe that I use the term handicap, but I told her, well, I say in my book, you need to ask the person you're talking to how they want to be referred to. If someone wants to be called physically challenged or differently abled, that's up to them. I like more concise terms, and I prefer handicap to disabled, but that's my personal preference.
Well, again, isn't it like that with people who are trans, for example, that some people want to be called he, some people want to be called she, some people want to be called they? It's about just being sensitive to what somebody wants to what they're comfortable with. And
Exactly.
I've been, ever since I had this conversation with you about the term handicapped, I've thought about how I'm by and large ignorant of golf, but I know that in golf, that if you have players of different ability levels, that one person shoots with a handicap. In other words, they're given a little bit of compensation so that they can enjoy playing together. And it
Exactly.
seems like that's how you've embraced the term handicap. Like, I just need a little extra so I can play with you guys.
Yeah.
The rest of you, quote, normies, as you call folks who are fully able-bodied. Well, Francine, thank you so much for the generosity of your time and your insight. Your book, Not a Poster Child, Living Well with a Disability, is moving and informative. And I'm wondering, as a last question here, if there's a resource or a website or something that folks, you recommend people go to, people who have physical challenges or handicaps or disabilities, whatever they choose to call them, that they can get information about their rights, their opportunities, and resources.
Gosh, I wish that I could give you one source that would answer that. For polio survivors, Post Polio Health International is the best site, and a lot of the information that they have is, applicable to other people with other kinds of handicaps. The Mighty is a source for handicapped people or disabled people, people with physical challenges, where you can connect with other people with similar kinds of challenges. And they have blogs and all sorts of things. I don't know if it's particularly a resource for finding assistance or anything like that, but it certainly is a good place to connect.
Well, we do live in an age where I know technology can be a curse sometimes, but in its ability to, when we use it well and connect well to each other, it's of vital importance. And certainly during this time of social distance and of shelter in place, that's relevant for everybody, and certainly for those who have additional health or physical challenges. So thank you so much today for being part of the Morning Glory Project, Francine, and I hope that lots of folks will find your beautiful book and your wonderful story.
Thank you. Thank you, Betsy. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'd like everyone to know how generous you are with your time, and the way you bring people together is inspiring. Thanks so much.
My conversation with Francine Falk-Allen kind of twisted my thinking a little bit in a really good way today. Of course, she's inspiring in so many ways in terms of taking care of herself and looking at life through different eyes, coming from a place of a physical handicap or disability. But she also said something I think that's relevant in terms of empathy, that sometimes well-intended people with good intentions trying to be helpful, aren't necessarily helpful. They're doing what they think the person would want, and they're trying to be generous, but it misses the mark, like building the ramps in a parking lot in such a way that it requires people to walk farther to get to them. And I've been thinking about that. We all have heard that golden rule in our lives, that do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But I've remember one time hearing about the platinum rule, and platinum being more valuable than gold, that instead of doing unto others as we would have them do unto us, that we do unto others as they would have us do unto them. That requires listening. That requires asking and not just assuming. And it requires not only just our good intentions and our generosity, but our thoughtfulness and presence, and customizing what we do for somebody and what they need, and not just giving them what we think they ought to have. Whether their challenge is a physical one, an emotional one, a circumstantial one. Tuning in and asking, what do they need? What would they want? How could I be of service? That's a pretty good extra bloom for me. I'm going to think about that and think about the ways that sometimes I try to help folks, and maybe I'm giving them what I want and not what they want. I have an extra bloom today, and that is that I want to mention a beautiful podcast called Stories That Empower hosted by Sean Farjadi. Sean is a gentle, sweet soul, and his podcast is just a little nibble of a bite, just about 20 minutes long or so, where he interviews people, and he just has a gentle way about him. And I think that you might just like listening in on that. So you can look up Stories That Empower by Sean Farjadi. Lots of extra blooms today. I hope that wherever you are, whomever you're with, whether you're by yourself or with others, that you'll find a way to bloom today.